I started asking the patient if this loved one ever communicates with him from, the other world into this world. And right as I asked that question, a buzzer fell off of my door. We can interpret this in any way, right? But the fact that happened, it was a very interesting temporal correlation or a synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence. And that meaningful coincidence was very powerful for my patient who was really stuck in grief, and it enabled him to move past that.
Welcome to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. I'm your host, Keith Fiveson. And today we have a truly remarkable guest joining us, Dr. Anna Yusim. Dr. Yusim is an internationally recognized, award-winning, board-certified, Stanford and Yale-educated, mind-body-spirit concierge, psychiatrist, and executive coach. With private practices in New York, California, Connecticut, and Florida, she's helped countless individuals achieve more significant impact, purpose, and joy in their lives and their work. Let's dive into our conversation with Dr. Anna Yusim. Hello, Anna. Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you here with us today. And how's it going?
Hi, Keith. It's going great. It's such a pleasure to be here with you again today as well. Thank you for having me on your show.
Well, you're welcome. And I know you and I have crossed paths at various industry conferences, and I've seen we're connected on LinkedIn, and we've had you on the show before, and it's a very interesting story and a really incredible background that you have. Can you share a little bit about your journey from neurobiology as a researcher to a psychiatrist, focusing on spirituality and mental health?
Sure, yes. So I was trained as a traditional psychiatrist. I went to Stanford for my undergrad, studied biology and philosophy. I worked in the neurobiology lab of Dr. Robert Sapolsky there for a few years. Then went to Yale Medical School, took a little time in between to be a management consultant. And then I started doing my psychiatry residency training, only to be faced with some unexpected things happening in my life that led me to question how the world works. And it was exciting, it was interesting, and it was in part certain things that were painful in my own life, the ending of a relationship, and also not feeling very at home in the residency program that I was in. And also it was things happening with my patients, interesting and unusual things that I couldn't really explain. So I go into depth in my book about some of them. But for instance, one of my patients had a dream about something that was happening in my life. And this patient had no way of knowing that this was happening. Nobody knew. And yet this patient was exactly accurate. And so it made me think, how in the world did he have this really interesting dream? That was one such thing. And then I had, other things. I had a patient who—
So wait, let me go back. The patient had a dream about something, but it was happening in your life, right? Or was it about you?
It was something happening in my life, and it was a very, very interesting thing. It was seemingly a little thing, but the patient picked up on it. So at the time, I'll actually tell you what it was. It was a very little, incidental thing. But so at the time, I was thinking about getting some hair extensions. And I remember the day prior to this patient having this dream, I tried on a few different kinds of hair extensions. And then I found these curly hair extensions that I really liked, and I was like, these are the ones. I think that day or the day after, a patient comes to me and has a dream of me with very long, flowing, curly, bouncy hair.
Wow.
Literally that perfectly corresponds in time with my trying on these hair extensions, right? Something so seemingly small, but I was like, that's so interesting. And of course, there's no way this patient could have known that this was happening, in the comfort of my own home. So it was little things like that, little synchronicities. And there were other things. I had a patient who had lost a loved one, and we were talking about that loved one. It was very, very hard for my patient to move forward beyond this. And I started asking the patient if this loved one ever communicates with him from, the other world into this world. And right as I asked that question, a buzzer fell off of my door. And, things fall all the time. However, that particular buzzer, which I used to let patients into my office, had never fallen prior and never fell again. So the fact
like a sign, was that a sign? Is that what you're saying?
That's the thing. We can interpret this in any way, right? But the fact that happened, it was a very interesting temporal correlation or a synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence.
Right.
And that meaningful coincidence was very powerful for my patient who was really stuck in grief. And it enabled him to move past that and move beyond that.
Wow.
So these kinds of little synchronicities started happening on a regular basis in my life and started leading me to think, very interesting. What is the meaning of this? Maybe the world works a little bit differently than I'd always been taught. And so that was the beginning of how spirituality entered my life.
Well, it's fascinating because one of the things I come to know as I get older and more so, and you've heard it, is the more you know, the less you know. And, it's very clear that, there's a lot that we don't know beyond the physical realm. And even in the physical realm, there's probably not so much that we can really control or we can really manage or we really know. Let me ask you, you wrote this book, your book Fulfilled, and I looked at it and it's really resonated with a lot of readers worldwide. Can you tell us a little bit more about the science of spirituality and, in your view, how it can enhance our well-being? Because it sounds like there's a real good correlation here between how it starts to link up and, maybe it's, I won't say it's woo-woo. I think it's much more around, inspiration, actualization kind of things in our lives. What are your thoughts about that? And how does it link up?
Absolutely. When I was doing my residency, I was taught about the biopsychosocial model of the human mind. So that is that the human mind has forces acting on it that are biological, psychological, and social, the biopsychosocial model. So now we are expanding that model, and certainly people are coming forth to make it the biopsychosocial spiritual model. This understanding that there are spiritual forces acting on us that are crucial to our being whole and that could contribute in the same way that biological, psychological, and social forces do to our well-being as well as to the difficulties in our life. And so this is what my book is about. And it's about how people can connect to spirituality, which I define as a connection to something greater than oneself. It's a much more intricate definition, but that's a definition that most people can relate to. And by that, for some people, that's God. For some people, that's the universe. For some people, it's a collective consciousness. For some people, it's a set of collective values like hope, love, trust, perseverance. And by that definition, spirituality does not, belief in God is not a necessary prerequisite for spirituality. And one need not be religious per se in order to be spiritual. And by that definition, many atheists can be perfectly spiritual if they are in flow with life and connected to something greater than themselves, such as these collective values that I mentioned. So
I'm glad you talked about that because one of the things that, I talk about a lot is, the Joseph Campbell definition between spirituality and the meal, or the meal and spirituality. Well, it goes religion and spirituality. So, he says religion is the menu and spirituality is the meal, the way you digest it. But I also like the root word for breath in Latin is spir, as in breath, spirit, as in inspire, as in respire, as in aspire. So you're really talking about something that really is what gives you life, what gives you breath, what gives you the capability to kind of move on and persist in some way, which is very different or similar, but not the same as religion, right?
absolutely, absolutely. And my favorite definition of spirituality, if we're going to be taking a more,
Please.
holistic definition,
Right.
is actually from Dr. Christopher Cook, a British professor of religion and theology. And that's that spirituality is this universal dimension of human experience. It could be intimately inner, immanent and personal, or wholly transcendent and beyond the self. But whatever it is, it's experienced as being of fundamental importance and concerned with purpose in life, with truth and values.
Hmm. Hmm. So it's interesting because it seems in reading your bio, you've really taken this even further as a clinical assistant professor at Yale Medical School, and you are creating a mental health and spirituality center. What inspired that initiative, and what impact do you hope it'll have? And where is it at? I know we had started to talk about that when we had you on the show, and I think that was a little over a year ago. But what's happening with that?
Yeah, so it is moving forward, and we have the first few research projects
Hmm.
underway for that. We have collaborators throughout and outside of Yale. We're actually meeting with the Divinity School faculty. The psychiatry faculty are meeting in order to create the foundation on the 2nd of April. So this is very
Beautiful.
exciting. So Yale
Wow.
has been very supportive.
Well,
And it's been
just in time for spring, right?
just in time for spring, exactly. And
Right.
it's been, a slow process
Mhm.
because, this is something quite novel and this is something a little bit experimental. And so to get people on board, to get people excited, that it's taken some time. And,
Mhm.
for me, this is one of my passion projects, one of my life projects. Whatever time it takes, I'm more than happy to usher it and shepherd it into the world. And it's been a true joy to be able to do it. I'm happy to tell you about the research. I'm happy to tell you about more.
Mhm. Well, I'm very interested to hear more for sure. Let me ask you within the center, because it is a spirituality center, your work really is expansive. I mean, it's very diverse. You're looking at everything from the Kabbalah to Buddhist meditation. How have these experiences shaped your approach, and what actually might we expect with any of those experiences, if any, at the spirituality center?
Yeah, absolutely. And so at the Spirituality Center, we are focused on the human experience of spirituality. So,
Mhm.
how all of these different things that you mentioned, as well as any other cultural, religious, or spiritual tradition, be it more a religious
Mhm.
spirituality or secular spirituality. And by secular spirituality, I mean yoga, meditation, prayer, journaling, personal prayer. Um, However, that impacts the human being and his or her well being, that is what we are going to be studying,
Mhm.
essentially.
Mm.
And so we have a number of different projects,
Mhm.
right? And there's a lot of data already that our projects are going to be building upon. But the projects show that whether it be a religious spirituality or a secular spirituality, that there are improvements significantly in quality of life,
Mhm.
in duration of life,
Mhm.
in overall well being, and also in recovery from various illnesses,
Mm.
including heart disease, including cancer, including mental health issues, including depression, including addiction. And the two places actually
Mhm.
in medicine where a spiritually based model is actually already the medical standard of care is within addiction treatment and end of life care.
Mhm. Mhm. So I start looking at, the idea of spirituality and mental health and physical restoration. And I'm wondering, for a lot of folks that might be on the science side, not the sacred or the spiritual side, can you sort of give your perspective as to why or what role spirituality plays? Because I do know that, even bedside manner, when, the doctor or the nurse come over and ask you how you're doing and have a conversation with you, the outcomes are significantly better than if somebody just treats you like, you were just a cog in the wheel, if you will. Why is that? And what do you think happens to the body or the brain or the biopsychosocial spiritual model? How does it,
Yeah.
how does that work?
Absolutely, absolutely. And, I think that
Mhm.
ultimately it's a physician, a doctor, a therapist, et cetera, really trying to understand the whole
Mhm.
person and not just the disease, and actually seeing the person as whole and not just as their isolated symptoms.
Right.
And so for some people, who are not particularly spiritual and would not define themselves as such, asking questions about spirituality and taking a spiritual history probably wouldn't really make much of a difference.
Might even
But
upset them for that matter in
it might
some
even upset them.
cases
They're like,
too,
who are you?
traumatized.
Who are you? Like, yeah, stay in your lane. Treat me as you should. You're my doctor. Ask me
Right,
questions about my medical symptoms.
right.
And, you meet the patient where they're at, and that's fine too. And, or the client or whoever it is that you're working with. And, but there is a lot of data showing that many patients, especially patients with terminal illness, with cancer diagnoses, et cetera, would really, really prefer for the doctor to ask about their spiritual beliefs, about life, love, and the world, and their beliefs about healing, about death, about illness. And very rarely are they actually asked. So high, especially among people in dire straits, high desire for that, and actually low execution on part of physicians. And so this is where the gap is. So one of our things is to really help doctors, physicians, therapists meet the patients where they're at, and to see spirituality as a part of, the whole person. And, you asked what happens in the body, the same thing that happens when you feel understood by another human being in any other way, that your cortisol goes down, you feel more in coherence, and you just feel more trust and are able to open up and receive the healing that you are there to receive.
It's very interesting. I don't know if you know a little bit about my background, but I'm a two-time cancer survivor, and one of the things that I really attribute to the doctor was, he did this whole visualization exercise with me, which was, sort of imagine a Pac-Man, and the good guys going after the bad guys, or the red blood cells going after all the white blood cells. And there's something about going into this visualization or this sort of simulation tank, that really, I think really helps. And there's some inspiration around that. To your point, the cortisol drops, the serotonin, the endorphins, all the good stuff, the oxytocin, because you feel seen, heard, and recognized. You think that's part of the contribution there, or it's maybe even more esoteric or more ephemeral?
Yeah. And I think it's probably a combination of both. And I love that. I think it's all of those things at the level of the body, that when you're able to have spiritual engagement, that the body reacts in turn. And, there's actually a lot of data on what is the relationship with spirituality that is most effective. So one, it's been found that actually, if you believe in a higher power, it's a collaborative relationship with the higher power that is found to be more powerful and effective for one's healing than believing that God's going to solve all your problems. On the other hand, there's also something very powerful in the very act of surrender. And sometimes people reach the end of their line. And to be able to surrender and to open up to that new level when there is no other steps that you could take is also incredibly powerful. And it's from that place that miracles take place. So it's very, very interesting.
Now that's beautiful to hear. I love that. I love the concept of all that, and like surrendering, right? Surrendering for a lot of folks is like, we've got to fight this cancer. We've got to fight it. We can't just let it take over. But that's not really what you're talking about. You're really talking about, to me, it's sort of like Brene Brown's idea around, vulnerability and authenticity and being real and being, intimate, allowing someone to see into you, to your fears, your uncertainties, your doubts, and really then sit with you and forge an alliance, maybe if it's not with someone else, with your higher power. I'm wondering, how do you develop that? How can individuals cultivate that? Is it especially, I mean, first of all, do you think I'm right in terms of the guide, the what I just said, the perspective around vulnerability and surrender, and then how do people cultivate that?
I think it's such a beautiful point. I think
how do they get real? Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yes, I think that your point about that is so well taken, that when you're able to open your heart and let things in and essentially become vulnerable with yourself and with others, things are able to move and flow more in your life. Now, how do you do that? The way that you do that is you remove the obstacles to vulnerability. And what are the obstacles, right? In Kabbalah, they would call it all of the manifestations of the so-called ego: hatred, anger, jealousy, remorse, contempt, anger, control. I said anger twice. So things like that. Now, how do you work on that? What do you do? And for different people, it's different things that you do in order to, for instance, remove anger or contempt, or really start to cultivate forgiveness for people who you feel, or circumstances even where you have felt wrong. And that could be your parents for a difficult childhood, or God for subjecting you to a certain situation, or somebody who actually harmed you in your life, or a bad boss, or a friend who betrayed you, or an ex-lover who, left you, or whatever that is, right? I think all of us at our core are actually loving, beautiful people, and it's removing the obstacles to that enables you to get into the vulnerability. And there's many exercises that one can do. And actually, I talk a lot about them in my book. But I also want to say that there's many things. For some people, it's reading Bible verses. For some people, it's meditation. For some people, it's going to a Joe Dispenza retreat and getting into heart coherence. And for some people, it's going and confronting people and ensuring that your voice is heard, and then you're able to set your boundaries and forgive and move on.
So what I hear in that is this whole idea of being able to go back and touch on the pain, the hurt, whatever it might be. It might be implicit, it might be explicit, the acceptance of, some sort of a terrible disease, whatever it might be, and then really accept that, and then move into a state of love and compassion and care, and kind of moving that forward. I'm wondering, you've worked with a lot of Forbes 500 CEOs, Olympic athletes, and some A-list actors as well. When I'm looking at all those things, and we're starting to talk about vulnerability and, being able to go into the story, how do you work with them in terms of, is it the same process? Is it a little different in terms of helping them to pursue their process or their joy in their lives to kind of move on?
Yeah. Every single person with whom I've worked has been unique and different. And for everybody, there's been a uniquely tailored approach, but there's definitely similarities. Many people with whom I've worked have had addictions, and addictions come in many forms. Drug and alcohol addiction, the most common, behavioral addictions, and that includes sex addiction, workaholism, addiction to your iPhone. And then there's addictions that are often less thought of as addictions, but are just as addictive. So psychological addictions to money, power, status, achievement, etc. All of those things are good in moderation, or sometimes even in excess. But it becomes an addiction when the more of it you have, the emptier you feel. And if
the more of it you have, the emptier you feel. Is that what you just said?
Correct. That's when these psychological things, which could be good in moderation, become addictions.
So the whole idea of harm reduction, because I'm also a CASAC and a CARC, and I work with individuals as a credentialed alcohol and substance abuse counselor, and work with individuals on recovery. But what you're saying is, and I like that a lot, is when you're not able to when you're not able to be the person you really want to be in your life, then you might look at it and say, hey, something's going on here. I'm misusing, and this isn't what I want to be doing in my life. Or there's just not a ability to manage the relationships you might have had before. Is that on point, or would you add some additional areas?
Absolutely, absolutely. And sometimes people are very aware that this is, something that's out of control. Sometimes it's their significant other or spouse that will shed light on, this is really an issue. And we're unable to connect because this person is preoccupied with this. But there's also, we talked about drug and alcohol, behavioral addictions, psychological addictions. Another form of a so-called psychological addiction is our addiction to certain emotions, such as anger. There are some people who are addicted to anger, or drama addictions,
Drama.
And drama addictions. And what happens is you're going to then create situations that are so drama-filled, or that spur your anger, unless you recognize what's happening and are able to get to the root of that and release it.
Right.
And
Well,
that's hard work.
for many years, I wrote my book, the mindfulness experience, and I want to talk about mindfulness as well. But I talk about, being raised in a dysfunctional household, and my mom died at 52 from misuse of alcohol, right? So there is a lot of that ACOA, looking at codependence, looking at ways of just sort of learning how to take care of other people's needs without necessarily taking care of mine. And I did find that there were some things for myself personally, like just drama addiction, like, okay, turning on the news, hey, 24/7 news cycle. Let me go ahead and swipe my phone left, swipe it right, see what else is going to go ahead and drive those oxytocin levels up, so that, not the oxytocin, the cortisol levels up, so that I'm feeling freaked out. Is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. It's like, it's so imprinted at such an early age,
Hmm.
and it's what's comfortable and familiar. And
Right.
unless we recognize that and then give ourselves the freedom of choice to
Hmm.
recognize that life could be otherwise and we can make different choices to
Hmm.
enable that, we're going to reproduce the same choice. It's our baseline, it's our default pathway.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And so then you're going to find things that create that drama, that create that trauma, that
Hmm.
create things that are going to anger you, that then you have to yell at other people for.
Hmm.
So this is, part of that whole addiction cycle, but it's a little bit more subliminal, subconscious, less difficult to recognize than ordinary addiction, but it's still in the same family.
I'm interested in your perspective. I have a perspective around this. How do you help people get the recognition and then make the different choices? What's your
Yeah,
pathway to that?
definitely. I have a number of different pathways, but I think one
Hmm.
of the key ones is making the unconscious conscious and
Hmm.
thereby giving people more control over their, experience.
Hmm.
So a lot of people who are doing this, some people come aware, but a lot of people don't come fully aware, even brilliant, amazing people. And they're like,
Hmm.
I have all this going for me, and yet I keep experiencing this thing over and over and
They'll
over,
keep
much to my
falling down the same hole. I walk down the
yeah,
same street and I can't stop that, right?
exactly, exactly. And then you meet them where they're at, and you're like, okay, so let's think about this. Where could this be coming from? And then you look
Hmm.
at their past and try to
Hmm.
understand where it comes from.
Hmm.
And then you give them different, action-oriented steps that they could take. And then things come up in the relationship with you that you worked through, and give them a
Hmm.
different way to resolve the things within you in the transference, working in the transference, they
Hmm.
call it.
Hmm.
And that also starts to paint a new picture. Sometimes these things happen quickly, and we have certain tools like psychedelics that could speed up this work. Sometimes it happens very slowly over time, over years in the course of therapy. But the
Hmm.
most important thing is that it's happening.
Right, and certainly a sense of the story and the narrative, and I call it the big tsunami. The sense that there's a tsunami coming over the ridge, and you've got to fight, flight, freeze, fawn. You've got to go ahead and jump into whatever your behavior is, so that you can go ahead and deal with whatever that tsunami is. But you're backing it up, and you're really kind of saying, okay, let's look at the triggers. Let's look at what it is that's driving that, and then I assume you're asking them to breathing exercises, meditation, psychedelics, and I do want to unpack the psychedelics area. um,
Yeah.
let me ask you, when you start looking at psychedelics, they've gained a lot of attention, and I know there's a lot of potential therapeutic benefits. How do you view their role in the mental health treatment process that you currently deploy?
Yeah. I think psychedelics are an incredibly powerful treatment, and they're, the legal psychedelic presently is ketamine, where
Mhm.
I am licensed, and then psilocybin now has become legal in certain states and will be legal in more states soon. MDMA, hopefully this year, will soon be legal as well. And I think that not only do psychedelics offer a novel neurobiological and biological
Mhm.
pathway to treatment, which many people who, for instance, don't respond to traditional antidepressants or traditional medications, they will respond to psychedelics. So that's very powerful. So, from a
Mhm.
biological and neurobiological perspective, it increases the number of people responding to the medications that we
Mhm.
have. But in addition to that, what psychedelics offer, which no other medications do, is a connection to spirit,
Hmm.
mystical experiences for
Mhm.
some people, not for everybody. but those are also noted. And that in and of itself can be a very powerful healing force. So you mentioned in your answer to, when we were discussing the last thing, Keith, about our narratives as human
Oh, yeah.
beings, right? Ultimately, we as human beings, I believe, are narratologists. We're constantly writing and rewriting our narratives. We're releasing.
Narratologist. I've got to remember that.
Mhm. Yes.
I love that word.
Yeah. Totally. We're
Narratologist. I
releasing.
love that.
Yeah.
I'm a
Yeah. Yeah.
narratologist. It's great.
Right. Right. We're releasing the narratives that no longer
Love that.
serve us and
Yeah.
bringing in the narratives that are more constructive and do serve us. So we constantly are upgrading our narratives. And that is narratives around who we are, about our past, about our identity, about who we are in this world, about how we relate to others and to ourselves. And as we upgrade those narratives, our lives begin to change as well. What happens inside of us ultimately reflects outside of us.
So it's that change your story, change your life. And a lot of people hear that, and a lot of people know it. But I think what I hear you saying even more so is that there are a lot of, ripples and cracks in the road that you need to go back and take a look at where you came from in hindsight. Where have I been? Where am I now? Where do I want to be? You can't go where you want to be if you're still holding on to where you were. So it's that question of the reboot, reset, reframe, and then moving forward that I hear you talking about. And say that word again, narratologist.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Narratologist, yes.
I love that. That's just so great.
Mhm.
Oh my goodness! Wow. What's the most profound insight that you've gained? Let me ask you another thing about your bio. You're one of the few people that I know. I've been to 50 countries. You've been to 70 countries, and I think that's absolutely wonderful. And I'm wondering, with all of your travels and all of your meeting with different people and different cultures and different economic stratas. What is the most profound insight that you think, and I'm putting you on a spot here, but what's one of the most profound insights you think you've gained in all your travels and your work, looking at the human psyche, the biopsychosocial and spiritual model?
Yeah, I feel that really there's no two people who live in the same world. We are all so unique and different, and that, we can never project. We can never really understand what is happening in the mind and heart of another unless we truly get to know the person. So, not to make assumptions, always give people the benefit of the doubt, and to really listen, and to listen with curiosity, with openness, with non-judgmentalness, to truly understand.
Wow. Well, that's a wonderful, thoughtful answer to the question. I was going to say, and when I'm asked this question, we all want to be seen, heard, recognized. We want someone to love us and someone to love. That's sort of the common quality of everyone around the world. And food, shelter, clothing, someone to love us, someone to love. And I think what you're saying is even deeper, because it really goes into the fact that all of us are living very complex lives, and we don't know on the surface what's going on, what happened before or what might happen afterwards. So just be present for the individual, meet them wherever they are. Is that?
Yeah, exactly. And to recognize that people, no matter who you are, no matter what things appear, everyone's going through something. Everyone is fighting a battle. Everyone is, not in every moment, but like in life. Life is just like that. And so also to have compassion, empathy for people. And then the other thing is really to master forgiveness, not for anybody else, but for yourself. If you can become a master in the art of forgiveness, you're going to have a really good life.
So, I think you've really positioned yourself as sort of, standing on the intersection of the spirituality and science, and an understanding of human nature within that, the context and the underpinning of what really makes people tick in a very big way. I'm wondering, how do you personally balance the rational world of science with the woo-woo topics of things like telepathy and manifestation? Because a lot of those, you talked about that a little earlier in terms of what you were going through, and then manifestation in terms of the whole idea of, just me talking about us talking about visualizing and being in a,
Mhm.
in a simulator. So how do you balance those?
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like that's one of my like purposes in this world is to
Hmm.
bridge that gap between science and spirituality, is to put the science to spirituality,
Hmm.
to the questions that you're asking. What does manifestation entail at the biochemical level, the neurobiological level, the psychological level? What is it that we as human beings can do to increase the likelihood of
Hmm.
manifesting what we most deeply want? And what is it that we human beings are doing to actually manifest what we don't want and to keep repeating that, right? So these are questions. And I sometimes will use woo language such as manifestation that doesn't necessarily have a place in the scientific literature. But I
Hmm.
also feel like I'm the translator between those worlds, right? The kind of new age spirituality and also the world of science and research and trying to figure out where things meet and how we as human beings just live this life and this world. I
Hmm.
don't think the answer lies in one or the other. I think the answer is in the combination of the two.
Hmm.
And I don't think that there's any question that should or could be answered purely spiritually, and any question that could be answered purely biologically or
Hmm.
scientifically. I think this is what Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung were saying. Sigmund Freud was saying
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
religion is and obsessional neuroses. The people who
Hmm.
need to believe are weak because they have this crutch God or the universe.
Hmm.
And Carl Jung was saying that actually no, religion and your spiritual life are a core part of the wholeness of a human being. And then it was Einstein who best reconciled this dichotomy in saying
Hmm.
that religion without science is blind and science without religion is deaf. And so you need both.
What a beautiful answer. What a really complete answer. And I'm wondering, in terms of sharpening our ability to kind of tune into those things, whether or not it's manifestation, whether or not it's telepathy, our intuition, I think to a large extent. What advice do you have for people who are looking to increase that area of their lives, whether or not it's to self or whether or not it's to others? Is it just about presencing or is it more than that?
Yeah, I think that there's spirituality
Hmm.
and then there's spiritual health,
Hmm.
right? And spiritual health, I really like the definition of spiritual health, and that's people who, when life confronts you with challenges, you're able to have an appropriate, good, and wise response.
Hmm.
You're able to feel your feelings. You're able to be able to have enough presence to move forward with a plan, etc. You're able to break down if you need to break down, but then also reconstitute yourself and move forward.
Hmm.
So I think, one of the questions you're asking is how do we have people have more spiritual health? And
Right.
I think it's as similar to my answer before, it's removing the obstacles to spiritual health. And that
Mhm.
could be emotional lability, that could
Mhm.
be um, lack of resiliency, lack of training as to how to overcome hardships or
Mhm.
obstacles,
Mhm.
um, lack of sometimes a support system,
Mhm.
lack of a psychological structure, or even
Mhm.
spiritual explanation for why these things happen. I think
Mhm.
often all of those things are needed for spiritual health. And so one of the things at the center that I'm starting and also that I
Mhm.
work on with my clients and patients is to help people cultivate spiritual health.
Mhm. Mhm. So, what I'm reading into that is the who, what, where, when, how, and why questions, the big questions. And those consistently change. It's not like, the world's turning around, we're consistently changing. Nothing's really, static or stagnant, unless you get caught up or hung up with some story or narrative that you've talked about before. And what I'm really hearing is that if you can ask those questions, who am I now? What do I want? Where am I going? What happened? How can I accept myself? Sort of like do an in-depth inquiry. It's really the contemplative aspect of, not where you've been, but, accepting that, but really being in touch with where you are and what the potential or the opportunity is going forward. Is
Absolutely.
am I hearing that right, or is there some
Absolutely.
correction? Okay.
Absolutely. Yes,
All right.
absolutely. Yeah.
All
And I
right.
think, with what you're saying also, it's just about accepting life on life's terms. And no
Mm,
matter where you want to go, first accepting where you are and
yeah.
accepting what is in your life. And from that place, making your plan, from that
Yeah.
place, moving forward.
Yeah, well, the old, from a coaching viewpoint, working with clients, one of the things that I work with a lot are clients that are saying they want to change, right? And change requires commitment, and the nature of commitment is challenge. So, really understanding what those challenges are, I think, is very important, because you can't really change unless you accept your story or the narrative or what it is that you think is, the problem, right? And then like accept the problem. The first part of, as they say, the first part of recovery is accepting, that you've got a problem, you know. So it's that element, and I like that. So let me ask you lastly, certainly not lastly, but in your opinion, what does it mean to have a soul?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question I got really interested in
Hmm.
because, in a way, a psychiatrist, psyche could be interpreted as mind or soul in the German
Hmm.
language. And so I always thought myself as a doctor of soul.
Hmm.
But the term soul was never really mentioned in any of my studies at Stanford or Yale or in my residency. And so I said, what happened to the soul? And so I started studying and I traveled around the world to really ask the question. That's where a lot of my travels came from.
Hmm.
What is the soul and how do people relate to the soul as it pertains to healing?
Hmm.
And my favorite definition of soul came from a Mexican shaman that I met,
Hmm.
Fernando Broca. And he said that the soul is comprised of two parts. The first part is that which connects us to everybody and everything.
Hmm.
And people sometimes say we're one unified soul, and that's what they mean. And
Hmm.
then the second part of the soul is that which encapsulates your own uniqueness, your unique talents, abilities,
Hmm.
um, the contributions that you could make, the challenges that you have,
Hmm.
in this world. So the soul is this two-part type thing, your uniqueness as well as your interconnectedness.
Wow, that's wonderful, and I haven't heard that interpretation before. One of the interpretations I've had is there's always a struggle between the spirit and the soul. The soul sort of wants to ground itself into the past, the who I am. It wants to go deep. It wants to go
Yes,
deep in relationships. It wants to go deep in terms of
yes.
history and family and so on and so forth. Whereas the spirit wants to fly, wants to, go
Mhm.
off somewhere. And the thing is that the spirit really can't go off somewhere unless it's connected to the soul. So,
Mm,
the soul can ground the spirit and the spirit can fly off, but there's always that conflict, of who I am, what do I do with my life rather than where I am now, what have I got, what is holding me, where I am, and can I move forward one way. So they really kind of work in unison in some way, was what I hear you saying. Yeah, that's great.
absolutely,
That's great.
absolutely.
So, lastly, I'm wondering what your message would be to our listeners today as we start to, wind up and go towards the end of our time together on the mindfulness experience. And what would you like if you were going to leave one idea or one concept at the end here for folks that they might sort of unpack?
Yeah.
What would that seed be?
Yeah, exactly. To always ask yourself what's the best that you can imagine for your life or for any given situation you're in. And then if you imagine that, say, can you imagine even better? So keep upgrading your vision for your life and tap into that every day because what we put on our attention on begins to grow. So we want to put our attention on the things that are positive, compelling, that we want to create, manifest,
Mhm.
actualize the goals that we want to meet and not the things that we are worried about or the past things that have traumatized us, etc. So that would be my number one piece of advice to our listeners. And
Mhm.
I wish everybody the best.
Wonderful, wonderful. So focus in on what's the best I can have in my life, really look at that, and then like go back to it and say, okay, great, I'm with that, and how can we go ahead and make that either happen or make it even better, right?
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
beautiful. That's really beautiful. How do people get a hold of you, Anna?
Sure, they can go to my website. It's annayusim.com, ANNAYUSIM as in Mary.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you, Dr. Anna Yusim, for sharing your wisdom and your insights. To our listeners, remember to check out Dr. Yusim's book, Fulfilled, and explore her workshops to enhance your own mindfulness journey. Stay tuned for more enlightening conversations on the Mindfulness Experience podcast. And until next time, be present, be mindful, and live fulfilled.